Hello. So last week I asked Esther a question, and I'm going to ask it again, so then she's going to come answer. The question was, what spiritual connection do we share with our loved ones who have passed away?
Good morning, church. Thank you, Tanya, for the question. You did mention that I was going to answer it, which is, the title of this sermon series is questions from the congregation, right? Not answers from the speaker, but we're going to try to do that. But just to begin, I want to validate this question and also thank you for asking it. This is a vulnerable question. It's hard. It's human, and it's really important, right? I might even say that it's a universal question. You know, when I'm in therapy, especially when I'm with couples, one of the things that I frequently will tell them is you need to strike always and never from your vocabulary. There's a little therapy tip for you. If you're in a partnership with someone, strike always and never from your vocabulary, because essentially, especially in relationships, nothing is always or never. But I'm going to break that rule here this morning, right? Because that doesn't hold when it comes to this type of question, right? It's not hyperbole to say that everyone will find themselves asking this question or something close to it over the course of our lives. If we live long enough, and if we love really at all, we're going to be faced with asking this question: what spiritual connection do we maintain with those who we have lost? So it's a valid question. And, maybe what's worse is that life itself is terminal, right? We all will face at some point in our lives the end of our lives. So thank you for asking it. And my goodness, last week I joked, gosh, you're giving me a real softball to begin this sermon series. But my goodness, this is the real deal. This is a hard question, right? The pain of loss, going through grief might be universal, but that doesn't mean that it's not gut-wrenching or scary or confusing or hard or just downright impossible. And for those of us in this room who've experienced loss, and my guess is that most of us here have, the question isn't just a hypothetical one, right? This isn't just theorizing. If you're anything like me, when Tanya asked the question maybe just a moment ago, or when she asked it a week ago, when she asked it, your mind immediately went to a person. And it wasn't, your mind didn't go to the book, or it didn't go to the classroom, it didn't go to what you had studied. If you're anything like me, your mind went to someone that you love and that you care about. And so it's consequential, right? Now for me, this question is not only valid and weighty, but it's also fraught. Last week I talked about experiences of religious trauma or religious harm. And Tanya and I, we actually came from the same sort of spiritual tribe or spiritual tree or whatever you want to call it. And in that tradition, I was taught that the way that we answer this question is a really, really big deal. And then, in fact, if you answer this question wrong, you yourself could wind up lost, or you could wind up in league with the devil. It felt like, for us, growing up, it felt like really, really high stakes. Now, you may not have that fraught layer, but that's what I grew up feeling like. I got to get this thing right, not just because I'm grieving, but because there's a threat at hand if I don't get it right completely. So, what's the answer, right? Tell us, Esther, right? I don't know. Yes. That might be as dogmatic as I'm going to get, is yes, we do maintain a spiritual connection, right? I don't know. And honestly, I feel a lot of skepticism and suspicion for anybody who does know or who does posture themselves with a great deal of confidence and clarity and dogmatic knowing about this question. I would be suspicious that they're trying to use that for power. I think the truth is that the only ones of us who really know the answer to this question are those of us who have passed, who have been on that journey themselves. On this side of it, I think we're making sense of it as the very best that we can. And in a way, I think that this question is like built for the ethos of sermons at Paradox. Like sermons at Paradox, if you don't know, are intended to start conversations and not end them. And so I lean into that hard today as I share a little bit of my message. Like I really appreciate the ability to contribute to a conversation and to share some of my own experience, and hopefully to hear from some of yours and maybe help the conversation continue on. So when Tanya asked the question, and I was standing about right here, I thought about a little boy named Casey. And Casey passed when he was 12. And I was 18, and he is my brother. And it's hard to imagine that it's been 25 years since the fire that took him. It's astonishing, actually. November 1999. It's been a minute, right? It was before the world was supposed to shut down in the 2000, it was before 9/11. Gosh. But like there's been a lot of changes before the iPhone, before Facebook. The world was a very different place then. But we had a fire in our home one night. And I don't know if I've shared that story here much at Paradox. My mom and my sister and I were home, and we were able to make it out. And my brother that night did not wake up. And that experience and my brother is still with me, right? Like I've lived 3 times as long in my life without him than having him. It's been such a long time. And so when my mind went, when you asked that question, my mind thought of Casey. And I thought of the ways that I've answered that question for myself over the years. And at least for me, the way I've related to my brother's passing has evolved over time, right? Early on, when I was in high school at the time, I was a senior in high school. Part of the way that I coped, part of what helped me in that moment was to have a real rigid fundamentalist kind of take on life and death. I had a very I was very much in line with the tradition that I grew up in, which was, a real materialist point of view, but also kind of the philosophy of soul sleep. So the metaphor that he was sleeping was really, really helpful for me at the time. In fact, I remember being introduced right around then to a play by a woman named Margaret Edson. It's a play called Wit. If you ever have a chance to see it, watch it. It's brilliant. Emma Thompson starred in a movie, and there was an HBO movie by the same title called Wit, and it's amazing. And one of the features of that film is this poem by John Donne, which is like from the 15th century or something. It's really old, and it's one of his holy sonnets, and I committed it to memory because of course that's what I commit everything to memory. But death be not proud for those who call thee mighty and dreadful, for thou art not so. For those who thinkest thou dost overthrow and not. And it goes on and on and on. Like this poem has meant so much to me, and it ends with the line of One short sleep past, we wake eternally, and death shall be no more. Death, thou shalt die. And that line, I think, really encapsulates the way that I have made sense of my brother's death, especially at the time, and it gave me a great deal of hope that I hadn't seen the last of him. Now, looking back at that moment, I feel a little bit of embarrassment because I not only believed that, but I had this kind of annoying sense of urgency, and I haven't checked in with that many of my friends back then, but I'm sure that I wasn't maybe the funnest person to be around because I was constantly telling people you got to be ready, you got to be ready, you got to be ready. And I had this, orientation that life was going to end at any minute because I had just gone through this trauma, and the way that I was coping with this trauma was leaning into this belief that I would see my brother again. So there's a part of me that feels a little bit embarrassed about how I related to it those 25 years ago. But there's also a part of me that's grateful. I'm still here on this planet in part because of that way of answering the question, right? What spiritual connection do we keep with the people who have passed? But, as I grieved my brother, it became really clear really quickly that what's helpful for one person isn't necessarily helpful for everyone, right? And, maybe it's because people are uncomfortable with, the finality of loss, or they don't know what to say, or maybe they see me and they project their own loss onto me, or I don't know, there's lots of different reasons, but what happened to me, and if you've been through, the grief of loss yourself, you probably have experienced some of this, but people, I experienced a lot of folks coming up to me to give me their explanation about why I was going through what I was going through, right? And these were unsolicited, advice. I have a massive list here, and I'm not going to read them all, but, they were things like, well, God really needed him in heaven. God, my brother had just decided that he wanted to get baptized, right? Had not been baptized yet, but the week before had told the pastor of our church that he wanted to get baptized. And so we had people telling us, well, God knew that he was going to, commit some grievous, terrible sin down the future. And so he, bumped him off right now so that he wouldn't commit that. These are stuff that people said. I don't want to traumatize you all, so I'm not going to say them. But they go on and on and on, right? Maybe the devil is tempting you. Maybe this is a test of your faith. On, all sorts of stuff that was not at all helpful. And God bless these people. Maybe that stuff was helpful for them. It wasn't helpful for me. I remember I had a conversation with this girl at camp. I went to summer camp and worked at summer camp for several summers. And my first summer was the summer after my brother was killed. And I remember having this conversation with a woman. I still remember her name and her face and what her job was. We had this really, I don't even know, one night after, campfire, we got into this conversation about life and death and heaven and what happens when folks die. And I remember us both coming to this point of just absolute mutual astonishment that the other could be comforted by what we believed. She thought it was insane that I had peace by believing that my brother was asleep, because in her mind that just seemed, so permanent and so final and so without hope. But for me, I knew my brother. I knew how much he loved his family. I knew how much he loved his life. And I knew how much suffering he'd been through. And I knew how much that he had been harmed by some family members in his life. And, the thought of him helplessly having to witness me and my family just, gut out our souls over losing him, and that he could somehow be happy watching this, That seemed absolutely absurd to me. In my mind, it was so much more peaceful, and it was so much more humane to imagine him in that one short sleep. I hadn't gone under general anesthesia at that point in my life, but I kind of imagine it a little bit like that, there's nothing and then you're back. And that's what I imagined it might be like for him. The more that I've lived, and the more that I've worked with people, and the more that I've pastored folks, and the more that I've counseled people in therapy, the more I've come to believe that the answer to Tanya's question is as multifaceted as it is common, right? So everybody asks it, and there's as many answers as there are us. And as it turns out, I think that is actually something that holds true in the Bible. Sometimes we think of the Bible as this one solitary book that came down at one point in time and that holds this authority through all history. But what we actually know is that it's more of an anthology that was compiled and edited and written over many, many centuries with many, many dozens of different authors and perspectives over many different epochs of time. And so with a book like that, as we might expect, there are lots of different perspectives, and I'm not going to go into all those details right now. I have a whole list. You could read Psalms where the psalmist declares that God is everywhere I am, even in Sheol with me, the abode of the dead in Jewish thought, this neutral, not good, not bad place that everyone goes when they die. But then you move on to Ecclesiastes, and the writer throws up his hands and says, who knows? He's sort of like me, I guess. Maybe I'm a little bit depressed. I don't know, but I always said the writer of Ecclesiastes was depressed. But then you have, it's not until Daniel, way, way later, post-exilic, post-kingdom, way, way long after the book of Daniel is written, and you have this idea of resurrection that's introduced. And then you have Jesus, who borrows imagery from the Greeks and talks about Hades and borrows all of this different There's so many different pictures and voices in the scriptures. If you want to take a deep dive, I highly recommend a podcast called The Bible for Normal People. It's by Pete Enns and Jared Bias. It's brilliant. But they actually have an episode about the afterlife. Oh, and the subtitle of the podcast is, so it's The Bible for Normal People, the only God-ordained podcast on the internet. So it's a little, you kind of get it, it's a little bit cheeky. It's lovely, though. But they spend a couple hours on a deep dive on exploring the different ways that the scriptures talk about the afterlife, way more time than we have this morning. So at least in my experience in terms of working with people and the Bible itself, there's a diversity of pictures about how we answer this question. So let me talk for just a moment here as we're rounding the corner toward the end, as has become my custom during the last couple of years as I've been able to be with Paradox Church. Let me share with you what I say to my clients in therapy. So I'm working as a therapist, and a lot of folks come to therapy to work on grief because loss is so hard. It's so disorienting and difficult and scary and confusing. And it's this overwhelming experience that affects us psychologically, and it's in our mind, and there are social impacts and emotional impacts and even physical pain that comes along with it. It's really, really difficult. And grief can be especially difficult when we come to it with expectations, right? I'm going through it, but I can't express my emotions this way, or I can't cry, or I can't do this, or I can't say that, or I shouldn't feel this way. Me and my colleagues sometimes we say, stop shitting all over yourself, right? Don't, this is not helpful, to identify what you should or shouldn't. But that we come to grief with all of these expectations that we inherit from culture and family and from gender roles and from our religion and from our backgrounds. And I think that a lot of times it complicates how difficult it is to go through grief. But what I encourage clients with very early on is with that message that grief is as individual as we all are. And that in many ways, grief is the process by which we learn how to stay connected with our loved ones after they pass. Like that, this question is what grief is in my mind. Grief is working it out in ways that work for us. And sometimes I might give folks a gentle warning, about disassociating from their grief. Sometimes we try to numb our grief away using different patterns or substances or whatever. Sometimes we try to, bypass our grief. Last week I talked a little bit about spiritual bypassing, right? Where we use platitudes like, well, God probably needed him in heaven, right? To try to bypass having to feel the pain of the loss, right? Sometimes I will warn folks about, hey, watch out for this. You might be tempted to disconnect from your community or to disconnect from your values as a way of coping with this grief. So there may be some danger in there, but for the most part, what I encourage people with is the way that you're grieving, the way that you're facing this, the way that you're working it out, the way that you're keeping or building or maintaining some connection with this person is the way to do it. And oftentimes I will sit in therapy. I've done it with several folks, actually. I have this book called Tear Soup. And if we had time, and also if I didn't have only 1 week, I would have put it up on the screen and maybe even read it for you. But there's this lovely little children's book called Tear Soup, and it analogizes grief as making soup, making tear soup. And it's a brilliant little parable of the diversity of ways that we grieve and that we make our tear soup. And sometimes we do it alone, and sometimes we do it together, and sometimes we go to classes to learn other ways of doing it. And sometimes we make it on days where we're feeling happy, and sometimes we make it on days when we're feeling sad. And sometimes we make it years and years later. We make our tear soup in all kinds of different ways. And maybe our tear soup, maybe it changes over time, So where does all of this leave us? Some of you all might be thinking gosh, Esther, you really punted on this question. You did not answer it one little bit, And I guess I feel like up until this moment, I focused more on sort of the philosophical side of it. And I guess, maybe I did punt, but that's actually what I think is what I said so far. I don't know. I can't be dogmatic about it. But philosophically, what spiritual connection do we keep? Yes. And now, as we close, I want to just talk a little bit about some of the nitty-gritty, the technical or the tangible ways that we might stay connected. And as I was thinking through and processing a little bit about what I wanted to say this morning, I really hate it when preachers do that too. Oh, I really hate it. I can't believe I just did it. I was thinking about what I was going to say this week, and oh gosh, please just tell us, okay? So I think that there's at least, I'm just going to tell you now, so I think there's at least 4 different, kind of groupings or categories when we think about tangible, the what do we do in order to stay connected with those who have passed. So I'm going to kind of give you a few examples within each category, okay? And then we're going to do a little breathing exercise because I've invited you into my therapy room with me. So one is emotional. Right? I think one of the ways that we stay connected is we get in touch with our emotions. We express ourselves. Gosh, cry. Please, cry. Cry a lot. Cry every day. Cry every morning. Cry multiple times a day. Cry. Let anger out. Right? There's lots of different emotions that come up when we lose someone. And I think those emotions are part of that relationship. They're part of that connection. You may have experiences of regret. We may have experiences of guilt. We may have experiences of shame or of fear. Whatever it is, I think it's really deeply important that we acknowledge them and that we express them. That doesn't mean you have to come on stage at church and cry in front of everyone. It can happen in private, but expressing it, I think, is really, really important. One of the ways that we express emotions is through telling stories. In fact, I keep invoking the sermon from last week, but one of the ways that we heal from trauma, from this overwhelming sense of pain, this overwhelming agony that we went through at some point in our life, one of the ways that we heal from that is from telling the story. And by telling the story, we're able to engage anew with what we felt and what was going on then and what we came to believe about it. And I think something very similar is true about going through grief. We tell the story so that we can remind ourselves how we felt. We tell the story so that we can rediscover how we're feeling now and how we feel about that event in this moment. That's part of the emotional what of what we do. We can connect through all sorts of ways. So I think that there's kind of that, emotional node or whatever. I would have some kind of brilliant thing on the screen to keep you oriented. A second what of how we do it, I think, is relational or social or, in terms of connections. And, I think sometimes we can have these moments of serendipity where we smell the thing or where we hear the thing or we see that certain type of clothing or we eat that food and we're brought right back to the person. And for some of us, it might be helpful to think of that person as being there in some way through, through dimensions or whatever. It may be a way that, for some of us, we might think, oh, this is God. This is the Spirit of God reminding me of this person. Or it may be a reminder of being held. Like our interpretation of that may be wide variety, but I think that those moments where the distance between the person that we've lost and where we are can get real thin. And I think that's, I guess I would encapsulate that in this sort of, relational capacity. There's a lot of Christian traditions that, really hold on to a belief that when folks pass, that there's a part of them that's still here or still alive or in heaven or in some place or around. There's a lot of folks who gain a lot of comfort from praying to saints or praying to people who have passed. I thought immediately as, maybe when I was down there last week, Tanya, I don't know, but I thought immediately of the ofrenda tradition from Mexican and Aztec culture. It's kind of this mashup of Catholicism and Aztec, but the idea of the ofrenda where which is a part of Dia de los Muertos. But it's this relational process of staying connected where we have pictures and so on. A lot of times I invite my clients to write letters to their loved ones. Sometimes they mail them, sometimes they burn them, sometimes they write them on a regular basis, maybe on an anniversary or once monthly or yearly. Sometimes the process of staying connected to the person who has passed involves forgiving them or forgiving ourselves. One of the things that I've learned about forgiveness, just being a pastor but also being a therapist, is that forgiveness happens within you and you don't need the other person for it. They don't have to be here, but it's very much a relational type activity. So we have some emotional sphere and some relational sphere. A third sphere has to do with ritual. It's all kinds of different sorts of rituals that we do. And I kind of grieve in some ways American culture because I think that it's part of the I feel like we've lost some of that ritual. And I've read some really fascinating books. I can't give you titles right now at this moment. I know that Atul Gawande is one, and I'm going to talk about him in just a minute. He wrote a book called Being Mortal, which is brilliant. But I know that in American culture, when someone passes, we're frequently, the person's body, it goes away. Like someone comes and takes it. And, for a long time, for many centuries, like even in America, but certainly in many different cultures around the world today, the person's body or remains stays here in the home for a certain amount of time. And there's a ritual quality to it. I mentioned just 2 seconds ago Atul Gawande. He wrote a book called Being Mortal. He's a physician who's just brilliant. And I loved the book, and he did an interview with Krista Tippett on Being, and it's great. And it may even be like one of the more recent ones. I don't know. But he's fabulous. And he talks about how, he grew up Hindu, and his parents were very, very devout. But he also talks about how, look, I'm a physician now, I'm a scientist, I'm not really Hindu, but this is what I believed. And so he talked about when his father passed, about how he traveled back to India and he sprinkled his dad's ashes in the Ganges, which was a part of the tradition that he inherited growing up. And he talked about the connection that he gained and felt as an atheist through going through this ritual. And I think that there's a lot of power in participating in these kinds of things that maybe we were given, or maybe we inherited, or maybe we restructure them, or maybe we, kind of make them work for where I'm at and how I believe now. But I think ritual can be really, really important. I know in my family, every year on March 12, we go out to eat. And we may not even say what we're doing at first. We all just know that it's Casey's birthday, and that's what we do. And every year in November, we pull each other tight, right? And when we smell the leaves from the trees falling, we think of him. And we eat. That's kind of our deal. That's our ritual. Some of us might have sites of honor. We might have markers in cemeteries. We might create a memorial. We may go to a place. It's what we do. We create rituals. For me, as I've gone through gender transition, every November 30, Transgender Day of Remembrance. It's a moment where the trans community sits together and reflects on those that we have lost. Because the world is a violent place, especially for trans women, and especially for trans women of color. And so we ritualize, we remember, we make sense of what life is like on this side, and we grieve the world as it is. A fourth category, and then we'll be done. It has to do with impact and meaning. That's what I'm calling this heading, impact and meaning. Sometimes part of our grief process is to make a donation in the name of one of our loved ones, right? We may use resources to try to make good in the world in the spirit with which they made good in the world, right? They're not here in the same way as they were when they were living, but yet their energy or their intention or their values is making an impact. Are you following me? There's a spiritual quality to which this can happen, and I think it's the reason why we do stuff like this, right? We might make a donation in someone's name, or all sorts of things. I remember reading way back in the day a book by N.T. Wright. He's a bishop in England, and brilliant thinker, one of the great theologians of our era who's still working. He wrote a book called Surprised by Hope, and it's about death, and it's about resurrection, and it's about a theology of grief. And one of the things he talks about that really stuck with me is this idea that one of the lasting impacts of Jesus' resurrection, or the story of resurrection, is that through that event, everything that we do now matters in this age and in the age to come. That he argues that the central message of the resurrection isn't so much about what and how and, the literal process of all of this. He argues that the central message of the resurrection is that in some mystical way, the things that we do now, the things that we love and the values that we hold will carry on beyond after we're gone. And I believe that with all of my heart. I remember going through a period of darkness, I don't know, maybe 10 years ago or something, and I watched this film. I've talked about 2 films in one sermon. It's another no-no on my list for sermons. But I watched this film called Cloud Atlas, another one that's based on a novel. It had Tom Hanks and Halle Berry in it. But there's this line at the end of the movie where one of the characters is kind of weighing making this personal sacrifice for a cause, right? And the cause feels like hopeless, and it feels like nothing that I could possibly do will make a difference. And they make this observation, and it's this kind of maybe the most famous line from the book. But what is an ocean but a multitude of drops? And for me, that I carry that value with me. And I think about Casey when I think about that quote. And I think about the drop that maybe was his life continues on and makes up this ocean of meaning of the world that we live in today. We could go on and on. So what spiritual connection do we keep? Yes. And it's hard. So I want to close with something that I do with folks in therapy, and that's breathing. This has been heavy for me. I cried. You may have cried too. So I want to invite you to close your eyes. And this is something that you can do no matter what you believe about death and what happens after we die. This is something that you can do no matter how you answer this question. I want you to close your eyes and take a deep breath. And just breathe in and out a little bit. And see if you can breathe all the way into your diaphragm. Just, we walk around with our abs all clenched all the time, trying to suck it in. Just ignore that and just really breathe fully. And as you breathe, I want you to draw your attention to that person that came to mind when Tanya asked the question. And see them in your mind's eye. Sense their love, maybe for you now, or that you felt once. And breathe in a sense of gratitude for them having passed through. As you hold them in your heart, see what comes to mind, if it's a value or a quality or an emotion or maybe a sensation in your body, a way that maybe God is speaking to you. Maybe some part of them is with you. And just hold that intention for a moment. And as you continue to breathe, Maybe wish well those who loved them. Maybe wish yourself well. Maybe wish that they might have peace. And I'll offer a prayer for us. God, we believe that you are here. And we also know that life is hard. And we hold with gratitude those who have touched us. And we hold in hope that we have not experienced or seen or felt or known the last of them. And we hold the hope and the power of resurrection in whatever form that might take close to us. And we say thanks for all that has been. And we say yes to all that will yet come. And we pray this in the human name of Jesus, in the eternal name of Christ. Amen. Thank you all.